Controversial topics are typically controversial because there are plausible positions on either side. That's what really makes it controversial. But a lot of times where emotions get involved, reason is the first casualty. Thomas Paine is one of the intellectual giants from the early days of our nation. And if you haven't read any of Thomas Paine's stuff, this is still really, really rich material. But at one point he said, to argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead. There are people with whom trying to conduct a rational discussion is a waste of time. If they have abdicated from the use of facts, if they refuse to allow information, you just need to move on. Now, David and I are writing a chapter about guns. And guns generate more irrational and heated controversy than almost any other topic in America. In the 20-some years that I was a opinion writer for the News Leader, the two topics that predictably got me death threats were gay marriage, which seems to excite people who are insecure about their own sexual orientation, and guns, which seems to excite people who are insecure about their sexual orientation. Now, here's the facts. For years, I've said that there are about 32,000 predictable gun deaths a year. The last couple of years, that's gone right up to nearly 39,000 plus. 40,000 gun deaths in America annually. About 60% of those are suicides. Several thousand are the result of domestic violence. Several more thousand are murders. Many are accidents. Although I knew someone in my student parish who had accidentally shot 3 of his wives. So I don't know, the definition of accident gets to be a little loosey-goosey. There are several hundred people shot in police action every year. Arguable about how many of those needed to happen. I think maybe 1 in 8. Almost none. There's about 250 shootings every year in which someone is defending themselves. 40,000 deaths, 250 are shootings in self-defense, which is the reason that most people give for buying guns in the first place, isn't it? That people feel that they live in a dangerous neighborhood or they feel endangered or threatened by someone, and so they buy guns. Now, I don't want you to let these statistics slip by you. For every person killed by a firearm in an act of self-defense, 60 will die from suicide. 35 are straight up murdered. Several die by accident. As Scott Martell said in a recent New York Times or Los Angeles Times article, the notion that a good guy with a gun will stop a bad guy with a gun is a romanticized vision of the nature of violent crime. And the sea of guns in which we live causes exponentially more danger and harm than good. It's long past the time to start emphasizing the well-regulated phrase in the Second Amendment. Now, I want to have a very sober and factual conversation about gun control, beginning with the observation that mass murders account for only a tiny fraction of the casualties from gun violence in our country every year. It's just that mass murders get into the news. We have murders every day, but it's only when an anonymous shooter goes into a public place and shoots several people that gets the news media interested, and that's what they feed to the public. So for a little while, the public is enraged and calling for action. But we know the steps to this dance, don't we? We lived through Columbine, Aurora, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Charleston, Dallas, Orlando, Las Vegas, El Paso, Dayton. We have a fairly clear idea of exactly how it will go the next time there's a mass shooting. At first, the NRA will be silent. Some politicians will come to microphones and insist that we not talk about it right now, that we have to let people grieve, that we need to show respect before turning a horrible incident into a political opportunity. Then someone will offer some sincere suggestions like having a moment of silence, putting together a public memorial, or going and donating blood. A few will even nibble at the heels of the gun industry, suggesting that we outlaw certain types of firearms used in the mass shootings. And I think most people are good. Most people are good, and they want to be helpful. And so there will be an immediate response of thousands coming into the street for memorials. There'll be hundreds that go to donate blood. After the Las Vegas shooting, the Blood Center in Las Vegas had to make an announcement that they simply couldn't handle any more blood. Whole blood has a shelf life. It only lasts so long, and they had more than they could use. They asked people to stop coming and bothering them to donate blood. Ironically, however, it was Congressman Steve Scalise who then went into the public and asked for everyone to go and donate blood. Scalise had just returned to Congress after barely surviving a shooting incident himself while he was playing baseball. He was really lucky to be alive. But here's America. Even as a victim of gun violence, he still felt obligated to provide cover for the gun lobby by going into public and suggesting that people donate blood to keep them from talking about actual gun reform. Now that shows the strength of the gun lobby. I can shoot you and you still go out and lie to cover for the gun industry. Because without the NRA's A rating and their political donations, many of those members of Congress could not possibly be reelected. Sadly, after telling the public that they didn't need more blood donors, when Scalise was asking people to come and donate blood, they changed their story and opened their doors for more donations, not because they could use the blood or needed the blood, but because they had to help trick a very gullible public. Now, donating blood is usually a good thing to do. I just donated on Friday. I donate every 8 weeks. It is not very painful if you are physically capable of donating blood. 30 minutes of your time and slight discomfort. They'll usually give you a t-shirt and, if nothing else, some cookies and peanuts at the end, and you get to possibly save the life of a stranger. We all ought to do it, except if you're doing it in response to a mass shooting, if you think that's got anything to do with stopping mass shootings. It's just about like telling someone that they're in your thoughts and prayers, which we know is nothing but an insult. It is a suggestion that you intend to do absolutely nothing at all. The time has come for us to take this topic more seriously. Now, there are basically 4 things that gun advocates, or Second Amendment advocates as they like to think of themselves, will say to shut down any meaningful response to gun violence. They will say that gun ownership is a guaranteed right in the Constitution. They'll say that guns don't kill people, that people kill people. And a corollary of that, as Paul mentioned, is always the suggestion that we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. Thirdly, they'll say that the only way to stop a bad person with a gun is for a good person to have a gun and stop them. And fourthly, they say gun laws don't work. If they did, Chicago and Washington, D.C., which have the most restrictive gun laws in the country, would have virtually no gun deaths, which is not the case in Washington, D.C. or Chicago, as you know. So those are the 4 basic arguments in defense of our current, almost entirely unregulated gun industry. Now, I want to take some time to address each one of those 4. The Second Amendment, which appears in our Bill of Rights, guarantees to our citizens the right to bear arms, claiming that it is crucial to maintain a well-regulated citizen army to protect ourselves against foreign invasion or an autocratic government. What was not spelled out in the Constitution was that the Second Amendment was actually a nod to slave-owning states where the number of slaves greatly outnumbered the number of white plantation owners, and they felt necessary to keep a large cache of arms to keep their African slaves in bondage. You think about even George Washington's plantation in Virginia, there were about a dozen white folk that lived there and 300 African slaves. So they were heavily armed to be sure that they could defend themselves against a slave revolt. Men and women, that's why we have an electoral college. It was caving into slaveholding states, and that's why we have a Second Amendment to the Constitution. They are both part of the machinery of slavery. And I don't know if you've noticed, but slavery hadn't been legal around here for about 120 years. So it's quite possible that we could do away with both of those parts of the Constitution that are really only in place to keep slaves in bondage. But even though the Second Amendment had this very embarrassing and ignoble beginning, still, for the first 200 years of our country, it was not interpreted to mean that every single citizen had a right to own a gun. That understanding of the Second Amendment was not established until the famous Supreme Court decision in the Heller case, which literally changed a well-regulated militia into an individual right to own a gun. It was an example of extreme judicial overreach, but now, unfortunately, it is the law of the land. But even this horribly misguided Supreme Court decision, the Heller decision, does not grant to citizens the right to own a tank, for example, or a bazooka, or hand grenades. The government retains the right to regulate and restrict within reason who can own particular guns. And until the last few years, the deliberation largely revolved around whether it was useful in home defense or hunting. Those were the two things that were used to determine what guns a person could have. For example, after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, Congress outlawed machine guns. They didn't institute a buyback program back then, but they did levy a $200 a year tax on machine guns, which in our dollars is about $4,000 a year. So an awful lot of folks no longer wanted a machine gun at that point. So by taxing, regulating, or in our case, ensuring, you might even be able to avoid a buyback program because people would have to make a decision whether it was really worth it to them to keep it. We never bought back all the machine guns that were in public hands in 1930. They have, however, never been used in another mass murder and have evidently largely rusted out of existence. A part of the argument for this measure was that the guns were only attractive for the purpose of killing a lot of folks. So you see, there at least was a time 100 years ago when American government could think intelligently and act accordingly. Most people now don't even remember that the NRA was not always a lobbying organization protecting gun manufacturers. They, in fact, in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was very much in the news, were advocating for gun control as a part of an effort to keep guns out of the hands of African Americans. Again, it's interesting how much race plays into these decisions, but it's been well documented that as the Black Panthers that were based in California, and open carry was legal in California, and there were a lot of news media photographs of Black Panthers carrying rifles in public places, then the NRA really wanted to regulate gun ownership and whether you could carry a gun in public. Even in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act into law, the president of the NRA conceded that though we are not thrilled by this, it seems reasonable to us. So they accepted it in the 1960s. However, a lot of the members didn't feel the same way. There was a growing number of gun owners who began to panic in fear that the government was going to come and take all of our guns. We've all heard our paranoid uncle at Thanksgiving articulating exactly that line. That real shift started in 1971 when there was an NRA member who had a large cache of illegal weapons, and federal agents stormed his house and killed him. So the NRA responded by creating their very first lobbying group, the Institute for Legislative Action, so that by 1977, the hardliners had assumed leadership positions in the NRA, and from that point on, it has been a lobbying organization defending gun owner rights. The resistance to the restriction on even bump stocks is an excellent case in point. In several mass shootings, a domestic terrorist used a bump stock to convert a semi-automatic rifle into a virtual automatic rifle. Now, clearly, if an automatic rifle is illegal to own, the ability to buy a relatively inexpensive upgrade that turns it into a semi-automatic rifle should be illegal, right? But the NRA kept saying no to anything because they've always argued that if you restrict anything, it's the camel's nose under the tent, and pretty soon the whole camel is in the tent. They kept stirring the paranoia of their membership, saying, if we outlaw gun stocks, they'll be coming for your handguns and your shotguns in a short period of time. They usually lead a paranoid charge against the imaginary day when Johnson or Carter or Clinton or Obama will come for your guns. If they choose to do so, Congress could make a rational case to limit gun ownership to weapons that are only plausibly used for hunting or for home defense. They did finally outlaw those ridiculous bump stocks, but the NRA didn't even like that. But the Second Amendment does not guarantee to anyone the right to own a military-style weapon. It does not guarantee to anyone the right to own armor-piercing ammunition, unless the deer in your neighborhood are tougher than they are in mine. There is no reason, unless you're the worst hunter in the world, to have an ammo clip that holds 100 rounds of ammunition. Now, the second argument that we often hear against gun control is that guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's true on its own, but it's unlikely that anyone would address the problem of Iran getting a nuclear weapon or North Korea having nuclear weapons by saying nuclear weapons don't kill people, people kill people. We are aware that lethal weapons are lethal, and so we want to address things like rogue states having nuclear weapons. Now, it's true enough that people are at times killed with baseball bats or knives, but you can't rent a 32nd story hotel room in Las Vegas and kill 60 people with a baseball bat. And yes, people can commit suicide in very many ways. It's just that if a gun is present, they are much more likely to be successful in killing themselves. I've been a pastor for 40 years. I've lost 5 parishioners to suicide. All of them used a gun. Dozens of others have taken pills or tried to gas themselves in the garage in a running car. They've all been saved. They've all received treatment and are all still alive. But about 85% of the people who attempt suicide with a gun die immediately. It is by far the most common method of successful suicide attempts. The other attempts, statistically, according to the Harvard Injury Research and Control Center, is only 3% of the people who cut themselves or take pills or use gas succeed in killing themselves. Suicide is preventable, but it is very hard to prevent in a house where there is a gun. Now, I mentioned that the corollary to this argument is the claim that we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. There is a certain truth to the idea that the United States' obsession with guns and violence indicates that we are culturally mentally ill. There are more than 300 million guns in the United States, which is almost half of all the guns in the world. Only a third of Americans own guns, though. I've had multiple death threats. I've had attempts. I've received cut up dead animals in the mail. I've received all kinds of threats. I don't own a gun. I own a baseball bat. And my old baseball coach can tell you, not that good with that. But if only a third of Americans own guns, and we have half the guns in the world, then there's a whole lot of people that have a whole lot of guns. We have twice as many guns per capita than any other nation in the world. Yet there are countries where there are also many guns. Denmark and Canada are good examples where hunting is very much a part of the culture, but they have an extremely low incidence of gun-related deaths. You might reasonably say that there is something wrong with Americans. Canadians have about a third as many guns as we do per capita in the United States, but we have 50 times their rate of gun deaths. So access to guns is the largest single factor, but even that's not the only factor. Meanwhile, mental illness, as Paul said, is about the same in every nation. About 1 in 5 folks in the world have a diagnosable mental illness. It's just that they don't go around killing everybody. In almost every instance, people who are mentally ill are much more likely to be victims of sexual assault than they are to commit sexual assault. People with mental illnesses are much more likely to be killed than they are to kill anybody. The difficult truth is that there's simply no way to diagnose in advance who is the most likely person to take their AR-15 or whatever big assault rifle that they've got and go out and shoot people. The guy in Las Vegas had no previous record of violent acting out, and yet he shot 500 people. He wounded 500 people and killed more than 50. There's no way to know what person is going to express their depression or cope with their bankruptcy or their divorce or more often the humiliation of going broke or being caught for a crime or responding to their miserable home life by going and shooting up a theater, a nightclub, a school, or a concert. The only part of this that we can even begin to control is the access to the weapons and the ammunition. More importantly, the mentally ill, we have to understand, are much more likely to be victims than perpetrators. So blaming mental illness is just another lie on the part of politicians. But in an absolute height of hypocrisy, Speaker Paul Ryan, who's still in the Congress at the time of the Las Vegas shooting, in less than 48 hours after that horrible incident, he was coming out saying that it was a mental health problem. And yet earlier that year, he had personally marshaled through the House, removing mental illness diagnoses from the ability to buy guns. They will do whatever they can to get more money to the gun manufacturers, even while allowing people with mental illnesses to buy guns, but saying that our problem is mental illness. Trump signed that law into force in February of 2018, and then immediately turned his attention to trying to legalize silencers. Again, if you need a silencer to keep the deer from running away from you before you squeeze off 100 rounds, you should probably take up chess or something. Trump's own son made TV commercials supporting the legislation to allow people, just like the murderer in Las Vegas, to put silencers on their weapons. This is the kind of failure of leadership that we've witnessed time and time again when it comes to sensible gun laws. And yet, a good Catholic like Paul Ryan can stand in front of TV cameras and blame the incident on undiagnosed mental illness. Now again, as I've said earlier, I want this conversation to be rational and factual, and here's the fact. Mental illness does not cause gun violence. That's just a fact. Researchers at the University of Texas, the medical school in Galveston, said individuals who have access to guns compared to those with no access are 18 times more likely to have threatened someone with a gun, even after controlling for a number of demographic and mental health variables. Meanwhile, most mental health symptoms were unrelated to gun violence. That's Texas saying that, folks. They concluded that taking all this information together, limiting access to guns, regardless of any other mental health status, demographics, or prior mental health treatments, is to reduce the gun violence through reducing access to guns. Now, if you believe there's a shortage of treatment for mental illness in the country, amen. Put more money into mental health. We absolutely need more mental health dollars. But don't think there's any connection between that and gun violence. Could be a relationship to intelligence on the part of elected officials. I don't know if you could you institute an IQ test for running for Congress? I wonder. But if you want to reduce gun violence, the only workable solution is to reduce access to guns. Now, the argument that says that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, well, you all watch the news. The last two high-profile mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, the police were able to stop the shooter in mere moments. In Dayton, now this is amazing to me, the shooter in Dayton was killed by the police in 32 seconds, a half a minute after he fired his first shot. In a half a minute, he killed 9 people and wounded 14 more in 32 seconds. And in some of the famous mass murders, such as the Pulse nightclub, there was an armed security guard at the door. Guess what? He was the first one shot. There was an armed guard at the Marjorie Stillman High School in Florida. Guess what? He had a handgun. He was scared to go in the school because he knew the shooter in the school had him outgunned. Still, as previously mentioned, the majority of gun deaths are suicides. The chances of death from a suicide attempt are much smaller if there is no gun present. Another of the top categories of death is domestic violence. Again, the most likely person to shoot you is your spouse. Well, you are the most likely person to shoot you. The majority of deaths are suicides. The second most likely person is your spouse. So if it takes a good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun, then you got to go to bed packing heat every night. As tragic as the death toll in Las Vegas was, and it was tragic, but more than that many people are killed in domestic violence every month. More than 50 women are killed by husbands or boyfriends every month. More than 1,800 women were murdered by men in 2016. The most common weapon used was a gun. 93% of women killed by men were murdered by someone they knew, all too often an intimate partner. There's a lot of domestic violence in our country, but if there is a gun in the home, the woman is 5 times more likely to be killed. Ladies, if there is a gun at your house, that increases your chances of being shot and killed by 500%. Further, a woman is 16 times more likely to be shot and killed in the United States than any other country in the world. A woman who buys a gun to protect herself is 17 times more likely to be killed with that gun than she is to be able to fire it in self-defense. We're talking about math here, and I've talked to any number of women who felt frightened who bought a gun, and I say, you are increasing your chances of being murdered by 1,700%. And they will insist, oh no, not me. But math is math. That's one of the really stubborn things about math is it doesn't care whether you agree with it or not. Math is math. if a woman owns a gun, she increases her chances of being murdered by 1,700%. And the math says there'll be 50 women killed by an intimate partner in the United States this month and next month and the month after that until we find the moral ability to do something to change the situation. Finally, the claim is made that gun control laws don't work. Just look at Chicago and Washington, D.C. And it's true enough. The gun laws in Chicago and Washington have done very little to reduce the rate of gun death in those cities, because a city's gun laws hardly matter to anyone who has a car, right? Or if you've got the wherewithal to get on a train or a bus. Gun laws do work in Canada, in the UK, in Denmark, in Japan, in Germany. After the Sandy Hook shooting, Andy Gopnik, the father of one of the victims, said, "There are complex, hand-wringing worthy problems in our social life. Deficits and debts, climate change. But gun violence and the work of eliminating gun massacres in schools and movie houses and the like is not one of those problems. Gun control works on gun violence as surely as antibiotics work on infections. In Scotland, after Dublin, in Australia, after Tasmania, in Canada, after the Montreal massacre, in each case, the necessary laws were passed to make gun owning harder. And in each case, well, consider the absence of massacre condolence speeches delivered by the prime ministers of Canada and Australia in comparison with our American president. In Australia, following the Port Arthur murders in April of 1996, in 12 days, legislators passed sweeping gun control laws, and the government instituted a massive buyback program that netted over 1 million guns. Australia had previously experienced a mass shooting every year. Since they changed those laws, it's been 22 years. There's not been another mass shooting. Now, people in Australia didn't like the changes. They had a gun culture very much like ours. Many of the legislators who enacted those new laws were not reelected. They all knew that they were falling on their political swords. But you know what? They did what was right in order to save Australian lives. And more recently, after the mass shooting at Christchurch Mosque, New Zealand's parliament voted 119-1 in favor of banning most semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles in New Zealand. Can you, in your wildest dreams, imagine Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump doing what is right, even if they knew that it would mean they would not win re-election? We simply have a different class of politicians in the United States than in many other Western democracies. There is something wrong with Americans, and most of that can be fixed if we would act like we were Australians. In the United States, following the Las Vegas shooting, sellers ran out of bump stocks. They increased the price by 200%. They still sold out of them. There's been a predictable rise in gun manufacturing sales after every mass shootings. Nothing increases the sale of assault rifles like the use of assault rifles in a school. After each mass shooting in recent years, I've gone to the Bass Pro Gun Shop the next morning to just watch who was coming to buy assault rifles. After Sandy Hook, there were families on vacation that brought their children to the gun store to buy assault rifles. Now, part of that is the fear that there'll be changes in gun laws, even though it's never happened. Gun sales were actually tapering off in the Trump administration because they didn't have Obama to be afraid of coming to take their guns. But since these last mass shootings, sales have picked up again. But that's not all of it. When people at gun ranges have been interviewed after shooting an altered weapon that does fire dozens or 100 rounds in mere seconds, they're asked how it makes them feel. and they report a feeling of elation, that it was exciting, rewarding, that it made them feel powerful. Is that because they made dozens of holes in a paper target? Or was it because they fantasized about how many people they could kill with that weapon? How does it feel if you own several military-style weapons? Do you think any of these repressed, fearful, paranoid gun collectors watched the same news that we watched, particularly after the Las Vegas shooting? The guy shoots 500 people, kills 59. How many of them do you think thought to themselves, I could do better than that? That's part of the problem with announcing that the Pulse shooting was the largest, then Las Vegas was the largest. Once you say that it was the largest, there's a certain portion of the population that begins to fantasize that they could do more. Even the guy in the Las Vegas shooting didn't take all of his guns to that hotel room. He had more guns and he had explosives stored in his home because he had an escape plan. He planned to do it again. This was supposed to be his first attack. Part of the problem with giving these monsters a name and news coverage is that there's a certain part of the population that only hears it as a challenge. Their work becomes a lesson plan for the next murderer. As with so many other of the modern challenges that we've looked at here, there is a simple, evident, and obvious solution to carnage we see every year in America. Every other developed nation in the world has already done what we have refused to do in the United States. As Gopnik put it, gun control is not a panacea any more than penicillin was. Some violence will always go on. What gun control is good at is controlling guns. Gun control will eliminate gun massacres in America as surely as antibiotics eliminate bacterial infections. Those who oppose it have made a moral choice. They would rather have gun massacres of children continue rather than surrender whatever idea of freedom or pleasure they find wrapped up in owning guns or seeing guns owned, just as the faith healers would rather watch children die than accept the reality of scientific medicine. This is a moral choice. Many faith healers make it to this day, and not just in thought experiments. But it is absurd to shake our heads sapiently and say that we can't possibly know what would have saved all of these lives. We already know. It's not just the 59 people who died in Las Vegas or the 50 women who will die next month in their own homes. It's the very predictable 40,000 people who will die this year needlessly. Deaths that we could prevent if we could muster the political will to do what is obvious and necessary and right. No more thoughts and prayers. No more asking for forgiveness. No more memorials or blood drives. This is a problem that can be solved, and there is nothing but moral shame for us if we don't do it. The good news is that the overwhelming majority of Americans want sensible gun reform. In an August 2019 NBC News and Wall Street Journal survey, they found that 89% of Americans want expanded background checks for gun purchases. 70% want red flag laws to identify dangerous persons and deny them guns. By the way, a few years ago, a guy called and left 5 recorded messages on the church answering machine and told me that he was going to shoot me in the 10:15 service, and he told me what kind of rifle he was going to shoot me with. Identified himself, we had his phone number, his name, everything. We called the police. I was at another church at the time. We called the police, and the police said, if he shows up, call us. Now, if we had red flag laws, we could have called, told him that, and they could have gone and confiscated his guns. Now, I'm here today because he did not show up. But when someone, and he was high, he was a drug addict, and if someone is willing to make those kinds of threats and has those kinds of weapons, we ought to be able to take them, right? And 75% of Americans agree with that. 62% of Americans, an overwhelming majority, a larger percentage than has elected a president in recent history, favor outlawing semi-automatic rifles. With numbers like that, you would think that elected officials would have to bend the knee to public opinion. But they have become masters of this hide-and-seek waiting game after each mass shooting. They simply have to make vacuous promises and then wait out the short attention span of the public. Emotions run very high right after a lot of people have been killed. But especially in this time in history where the 24-hour news cycle is controlled by a sociopathic president, we move on to another topic, and people forget very quickly. Following the August shooting in Dayton, I would call it a shooting rampage, but can you call something a rampage if it only lasts 32 seconds? It was a violent outburst, right? At the vigil, Ohio's governor showed up to speak to the gathered throngs in the streets. Republican Governor Mike DeWine tried to deliver the same platitudes that Republicans always offer while the blood of innocent citizens is still wet on the pavement. He started out by pointing out that the size of the crowd that had gathered for the vigil, saying that these thousands of people represented the love and resiliency of this great and wonderful community. And that's as far as he got. A man shouted out from the crowd, "Do something!" And then a roar came up from the crowd as others joined in, and they just chanted over and over, "Do something, do something, do something," because we all know that what's behind the platitudes and the crocodile tears and the thoughts and prayers behind Mitch McConnell's promise that we'll discuss this when the Senate is back in session, or the president's assurance that this time we'll have to take action. But we know what they're doing. They're just waiting for a fickle public to go on and worry about something else. The survivors in Parkland swore that they would not let the issue die, that they were devoted to real change. But the power of the status quo is strong. You would think that the parents of the kids who died at Sandy Hook would be able to hold on to the microphone, that we wouldn't so quickly forget about the victims at the Mother Emanuel Church, at the Pulse nightclub. But people can't seem to maintain the needed passion, and the gun lobby knows it. They bank on it. They bank on it pretty big. And so far, they have always been right. But what if we do something? I was inspired when I was listening to news stories about the protesters in Hong Kong, and I was really surprised to hear in the background, behind the reporter, that the crowd was singing that song from Les Mis, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" Singing the song of an angry man. Gave me an idea. We never get gun laws changed because after each mass shooting reported in the news, there's talk about sensible gun reform, and in a couple of weeks the news cycle moves on and everybody loses their passion. But what if we got a group of 20 or 30 people together to do flash mobs in gun shops, at Bass Pro, at Walmart? We're not that far from Bentonville, where the world headquarters of Walmart is. What if we just had 20 or 30 people show up in a flash mob and start to sing, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" It could keep the topic in the news. And what if we did it enough to inspire other churches to do it? And what if we kept it up week after week after week and kept it in the news? It could possibly embarrass the gun sellers, assuming that some of them have a conscience. I don't know if they do. There's no evidence that they do. But if they do, we could embarrass them. And maybe, just maybe, we could start a movement that would keep the topic in the news until there was actual gun reform. It is a kind of civil disobedience, and I suspect that eventually it would be construed as being illegal and somebody would get arrested. But, I'm 63 and I've never been arrested. And if it doesn't happen now, when's it going to happen?
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.